All right. Well, now the time has struck. Let's begin. Let me welcome everybody to the Future Trends Forum. I'm very glad to see you all here. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's creator, host, and chief cat herder, and I'll be with you for the next hour. And we're very glad to see all of you here. Before we begin, let me give you some background on the forum, where it comes from, how it works, and who supports it. So, Tara, over to the next slide, please. You should know that the forum is the video discussion-based spin-off from the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. If you haven't seen this, FTTE is a monthly trends analysis that takes a look at 4 or 5 weeks of current trend lines and then sees how they can be extrapolated forward into the future. Now, we look at trends from across many domains, from education, policy, demographics, economics, to technology and educational technology. We've been doing this for years, so we now have a pretty good database of trends that we can track over time. If you haven't seen this yet, go to ftte.us and you can find out more. This is the other thing about this. If we go to the next slide, please, is that this is part of my overarching work on the future of education. If you go to futureofeducation.us, you'll see the forum, you'll see the FTTE report, as well as a blog, as well as the online book club, as well as links to 2 forthcoming projects, 1 podcast and 1 store. So if you're interested in finding out more about the Future of Education Observatory, just go to futureofeducation.us and you can find more. Next slide, please. Now, this discussion that we're having is an international one. And it's very important to recognize this. It's very easy for most people in higher education to focus on their nation or their region or even the smaller geographical domain. But for most of us, the smartest thing to do is to focus on education as internationally and globally as possible. You can see from this map that we've had people sign in from just about every continent on Earth. I've led this from at least 3 different continents. So please, as we proceed, keep in mind not just where you are geographically, but the global dimensions of higher education and technology. Next slide, please. Now, we can only do this with the help of sponsors who keep us going, and I want to thank and recognize them before we proceed. First, I want to thank MiserNet from New York State. This is a nonprofit that works to get that state's colleges, universities, as well as museums, libraries, and hospitals all online. We're grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to Shindig, because as you can tell, Shindig makes available the technology we're using now. So let me just take you through it so you can see some of the different parts. Where I am and where this slide is for right now is the stage. This is a spot where everyone can be seen, everyone can be heard. And this is where our guest is going to be in just a minute, and this is where all of you can be if you'd like to join us. Now, below us is what I think of as the participant swarm. So if I look down right now, I can see David Rass, Mark Ouellette, Rebecca Rotondo, Michelle Pancansi, I can see Brenda, Robin DeRosa, actually that's her and her husband there, Phil, probably looking astonished that I'm pointing them out. And all of those are different people, different assignments. Now, if you'd like to have a private conversation with somebody, just double click on them. And if they want to talk to you, your 2 icons will click together and you'll have your own portable, personal, audiovisual bubble. And as you'll see, we'll have more and more people joining us. Now, the participant swarm is broken into groups of about 18 right now, based on when you log in. So I'm looking right now at a whole group of people. If you want to switch rooms or see who else is here, look at the bottom of the screen. There's a white strip running along it. On the left edge of it, you'll see a number with some people. The number I've got right now is 47. If you click that, you'll get a kind of slideshow of all the different people who have logged in, which is pretty handy. And if you want to switch rooms, just move all the way to the right or all the way to the left of the participant swarm. You'll see a big white bracket. Click that and I'll pop you into the next room so you can chat with people. Speaking of chat, there are 3 ways to interact with people, because what I'm doing right now, talking to you, is not what this is about. What this is about is your conversation, your contributions, your questions, and your comments. We have 3 different ways for you to commit all of those. So back into that white strip. You see that number 48. To the right of that is a little kind of like a dialogue box from a comic strip. If you click that, you'll have a chat box, and that's for you and the 18 or so people who clicked in with you. So right now, I've been hearing different or reading different people talking about their atrocious weather or their nice weather, depending on where they are. Except Myron Williams has no snow, only cold. please chat, use the chat box. It's a good place to ask questions, to make comments, and I'll be monitoring my room. And this is a way to quietly, quickly communicate with people here. Now, on that white strip to the right of it, you'll see a question mark within a circle. If you click that button, you'll be able to type in a question or a comment, which we can then flash on the screen and which I'll read out loud for everyone to hear. So that's a really good way just to push in a specific observation. And people do this all the time. Now, if your mic isn't working and your camera isn't working and you're in a place where you feel that you can speak out loud, like I am now, then click on that raised hand button. This is really neat. That raised hand tells us that you want to join us on stage. And so if you click that, once the situation is right, we'll beam you up on stage and you can join us and have a conversation. If that sounds tricky, it's actually faster and easier to do than I just described, and people will do it all during the hour. So again, chat box, the question box, the raised hand, you can join us anyway, and that's the whole idea here. Shindig makes this available. We're very grateful then for their support. And the last source of support that I want to thank, which is really, really important, is the dozens of people on Patreon. If you haven't seen it, Patreon is a crowdfunding site like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. And the idea is to support a creative person as they're developing stuff. So in my case, I'm developing material, media, and meetings and content about the future of education. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you'll see dozens of people who contribute at least $1 a month just to make sure that we can keep doing this kind of work. We're really grateful to those fine patrons, and we hope you can join them. Now, speaking of joining us, let's cut to this week's guest. Coming to us from snowy and cold Detroit, we have Professor Chris Gilliard. He's a professor of English at Macomb Community College. He is known for many, many things, including a great Twitter feed, Hypervisible is his handle. But today we want to draw attention to him and talk with him about his concept of digital redlining, what that is, what that means for education technology going forward. So Tara, if you could knock the slides out of the way and beam Chris on stage, we can begin. Now, as this is happening, you have to imagine like a Star Trek sound effect. Please keep in mind, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get the thing rolling, but once we do, please chime in with your questions and comments. Professor Gilliard, Chris, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well, Brian. Thank you.
Good, good. I have to ask, since you're in the Detroit area, snow, cold, ice?
Yes. I actually have not been outside today, but I have my fireplace running because it's extra cold, single digits.
Wise man. I mean, the fireplace. Yeah. Oh, good. Well, I'm really glad that you had the time to join us right now, especially in the beginning of the semester. I've been following your career and been learning from your work for years now. It's an honor to be in the same place with you.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That's really flattering. I appreciate it.
Well, that's quite true. So to begin with, just to get everybody on the same page, tell us what you do right now. What are you researching more on digital access, and what are you teaching?
So my main gig is I'm a professor of English at Macomb Community College, as you noted. And what I'm really interested in and what I work on in my classes and out is, I don't know how I would necessarily describe myself, but I might describe myself as a privacy and student data rights activist. So I do a lot of, I've been fortunate enough to be invited to quite a few places to give talks about questions of digital redlining and access and privacy, especially as it applies to students. And, teaching at the community college has given me quite a bit of insight on how those issues affect specific communities. I've taught at a couple different places. I was at a small Jesuit institution, and I taught at Michigan State University for a few years.
Oh no!
And now,
I didn't know.
Yeah.
Oh, that's terrible. I'm sorry. I'm glad things have improved.
And each one of those has given me a different perspective, but definitely teaching at Macomb has given me some insights that I probably wouldn't have gained without being there.
Well, I really admire your student-centered focus. In fact, for those of you who haven't had a chance to take a look at Chris's scholarship, I've shared two of the articles on Twitter just now. And the one, not the EduCause one, but the another one begins with a detailed from commonsense.org. It's a detailed description of a student experiencing digital redlining. So to get things going, why don't you give us a quick intro of how digital redlining works and where it comes from?
So, what? I'll begin it. I'll tell you how I began to notice it. So, I've shared this anecdote a lot of times, and it's also in a couple of the essays. But as I mentioned, I do a lot of work with technology, and I had my students. My students were working on some projects, and the idea of what had been called revenge porn, but now is called non-consensual intimate images, I believe. But my students were off to do research on that, and they couldn't find anything. And so I know there's tons of scholarship out there, right? I mean, I didn't tell them who to look for, but I knew specific people who had done scholarship on that. My students came to me and said, "Well, there's no such thing, right? There's no writing on it," which I knew to not be the case.
Right.
And then I realized that our internet on campus was filtered. And so I began to see, like, so this is what happens, right? And it's very pernicious in that it's invisible, right? Because so if you don't know something exists and you're looking for, and you're searching on the internet, right? And you don't get results, right? You're the natural assumption, right? And this is just not with students. I mean, I've had many conversations with professors about this. The natural assumption is that it doesn't exist. So because I had them looking for something that I knew to exist, right, I started to see the really evil effects of something like this. And so I started to dig more into it and find out why the internet was filtered on our campus, and think about ways to challenge that, to talk to my students about it, to talk to other professors about it, to see what other institutions were doing. And it all sort of branched out from there. And so my colleague Hugh Kulik and I have done a lot of work at our institution to challenge that, but also done a lot of research, and a lot of thinking about, what other ways, specific policy decisions, right, specific actions, specific code, plays into reinforcing, class and race distinctions in what I find to be very harmful ways. And again, it's important to assert that to many people this is invisible. So just to give another example that I give to my students all the time is that different colleges have different journal access. And so oddly, a lot of people don't know this fact. So my students, I mean, at a school that can't afford the same access as Michigan State, for instance, if they're looking for something using JSTOR, right, they're going to have a lot fewer options than the students at Michigan State. Well, again, you can quickly see how information access affects your ability to do your work, your ability to answer questions, the ability to expand your base of knowledge. But again, the one of the worst aspects of it is that people don't know that, right? So they don't even know what they're not getting.
So these are unknown unknowns.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of how I got started, and I've been doing this particular work for maybe about 4 or 5 years now.
Well, this is huge and powerful stuff. And friends, I'm going to have all kinds of questions. And among other things, there are links to a wide variety of topics that we've already been touching on in the Future Trends forums the past 2 years. But I really want to hear your questions and comments. So again, please use the chat box, click on the raised hand and join Chris and I up on stage, or just click the question mark if you have a question that you want to share with us or a comment. I'm going to try and keep an eye on Twitter, but I can't always do that because I'm kind of busy. Just to continue with this, I'm really, really struck by this question of invisibility, that you can't know what you don't know. So if you're searching for scholarly materials on It depends on what's being censored, but it could be on Armenian genocide, say, or on the Tiananmen Square massacre, and those nations may block or ban this. How often do students know if their content is being filtered?
Well, a lot of times they don't. I mean, because we're often asking them
Mm,
things to research things that are not their area of expertise. Um, and
right.
also, I mean, the other thing I want to include is that most people also don't know how search engines work. And Google is one of the. I mean, it's the biggest defender
Wow.
of this thing, right? I mean, it's because Google. People think Google. I mean, and there's people who've done great work on this, and I always gotta hype them. If you don't know who Sophia Noble is,
Hmm.
definitely look at her work. She's got a book coming out. Um,
Good.
but people think that Google exists to give you answers, and it doesn't. Right? It exists to track you and sell you things. Right? Giving you answers is the sort of extra thing. And so, because it doesn't exist because it existed to track you and um, sell you things, that affects to a large degree what kind of answers people get. I mean, people type questions into Google, right? Um, and that affects what it looks at where you are, who you are, what you've searched, what kind of machine you're using, like
Hmm.
on and on and on and on. A lot of people don't know that, or they don't know how deep that effect goes, right?
Right.
And so, with some things, right, if you want to know like what the movie times are in your area, like Google's fine, right? But when you're getting into ideological issues, when you're getting into, I mean, I don't know if how familiar people are, but I mean, Google has notoriously been gamed by Nazis and racists over the last several years. And if you want to go further back than that, you could look at the Santorum incident, a Google bombing, so there's
Yep.
a long history of that. Um, some of that Google has addressed, some of it they're very reluctant to address. Um,
There's an interesting
be,
piece this week in the New York Times about climate change ads. So if you
mm-hmm,
type in a question or a topic of climate change, uh, some people, climate change billionaires, oil companies presumably have paid for high profile ads to show up. And again, if you don't, as you say, your students don't know how this works, then they might click on these or treat them as legitimate.
right, right.
We have some. I want to pursue this, but we have some more questions that have just come up. And if we have one from Robin DeRosa from Frozen, New Hampshire. And if Robin, if we take a look at Robin's, please. I'd love to hear Chris talk about net neutrality. Are we losing it? Did we have it? And what does all this mean for higher ed? Great question. Great question.
Yeah. Hey, Robin. Um,
Robin,
that
please.
is a good question, and I can only I can only guess, right? So one of the things is I think that for a lot of people here amongst us, I mean, and some of this is going to depend on where you live. You and I, Brian, have had some discussions about rural versus city, right? What that
Oh,
means for access.
oh.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, I'm making some assumptions about the audience, but I think for a lot, I mean, I pay for the best internet access that my area offers. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be able to afford that. I think for a lot of us, we may not see significant changes. That is my guess. I mean, the big fear with net neutrality is tiered access, right? And you can see, yeah, if you want to think about it, I don't know if people are familiar with the Free Basics initiative of Facebook, and
Why
which
don't you
was
explain that?
basically which was basically Facebook going to places, like going to like India and saying, "Hey, we'll give everyone free internet, but it'll be through Facebook, right? So you can, if you have a phone and you have the Facebook app, we won't charge you for data as long as you stay on Facebook." Well, it sounds great and altruistic until you think about, well, again, what is Facebook's job, right? Like, how does Facebook make money? Like, what is Facebook's purpose, right? It's not to help you. It's not community, no matter how many times Zuckerberg says it. I mean, it's an advertising and surveillance monster. Okay, and so and again, we've seen the unfortunate effects of people getting primarily getting their information with Facebook as the arbiter. And so with net neutrality, and by the way, India rejected free basics, but there's some other places that do have it. The primary fear with net neutrality, as I look at it, is tiered access, such that certain communities, certain areas, and I don't think I'm going out on a limb by suggesting this is going to disproportionately affect, Black and brown people, persons of color, rural areas, students are going to have a certain kind of internet package that's very different from the one that I pay for, right? And so a lot of these things that I talk about in terms of digital redlining stand to get a lot worse, I imagine. I mean, I don't think anyone knows for sure what that's going to look like. And also the cable companies are very good at masking their intentions, and so I mean, they have, they fight. For instance, there are lots of communities that have tried to create their own broadband, have local internet, right? And some states and some municipalities have laws against that, right? Thanks, cable industry. But the ones that don't, cable has lobbied very hard to make it seem like it's in your best interest to just have Comcast or to just have AT&T. And they're very good at that. I mean, these are issues that a lot of people don't have the luxury of studying deeply, and they're made opaque on purpose.
Yes.
And so I think, so that's what I think will happen. I mean, I think colleges in themselves, or at least large colleges with lots of money, on campus, there won't be, I doubt that it will be significant changes. I doubt that there'll, it's on people's phones where they'll start to see differences. It's at home where they'll start to see differences. It's in their, it's in the autonomous vehicles we'll all be forced to ride in, where we'll see differences. Right? That's my guess anyway.
That's a wonderful answer. I wish I'd had that answer when I did a couple of long blog posts on the subject, because that's much better than what I had. Robin, this is a great question. Jay Geddy, forgive me, Jay, if I mispronounced your last name, adds in chat, loss of net neutrality means more incentives for more user tracking and surveillance by ISPs.
Yes, absolutely. That's completely true. Because that's how you'll pay for your internet with more surveillance, right? I mean,
and we already a principle for that. I mean, we pay for Gmail by surveillance.
Exactly.
We have another question coming up, but let me just remind everybody, please, this is rich, exciting, scary stuff. Please feel absolutely comfortable asking questions. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, the bottom of the screen, there's a white strip that has a few different icons. On the left edge, you'll see different options for either typing in questions or typing questions to each other in chat, or clicking the raised hand to join us up on stage. We have a question from Michael Berman in California right now.
Hey! Michael Burns, my good buddy, so I got to give him a shout out whenever I hear his name.
It's going to be a hard question now, I know. Chris, I know your work has generated a lot of positive interest, but I'm interested in whether you're getting pushback with that, and if so, what kind? Good question.
That is a good question. And I've actually been surprised by how little pushback I receive. And I'm not, I don't really feel like what I'm saying is very controversial, and maybe that's the reason, but I also think that, I think when we start to talk about some of these internet issues in terms of who's going to pay for things, I'll start to get more pushback. Right. I posted something today that I tagged, #, digital redlining. and somebody came back and said, well, we kind of are going to need to have tiered access because who's going to pay for it? And, I mean, I think, so, I mean, if you look at the history of utilities, there came a point where we said, well, you know what, everybody kind of needs to have this to function.
Right.
And you can debate me on this, but I think I would argue we're past that point with the internet. We've seen some dismantling of, and there were some Bush era and Obama era things that were, they were improvements, however slight, on this notion. And current administration has done a lot of damage to that, right? Because I think if you want to, I don't know how. Maybe I should do more work on this. I don't know how controversial it was to say, you know what, everyone should be able to get mail. Like, now, if there's a postal scholar in the audience, please correct me or help me out. I imagine that it wasn't controversial. It was difficult, but I don't see that as a far out claim. I think everyone should have the internet. I think that the degree to which we've kind of handed it over to a couple of large companies is, to all of the detriment of all of us. So to get back to the question, I haven't received a ton of pushback because I think, and when I think about it, I don't know that someone's going to come to me and say, well, poor people actually do deserve less information. Like, that's not a really strong. I don't feel like you can make that. It's not a strong argument, or it's not a position where many people don't articulate openly, I don't think.
No, I wonder if you'll hear the argument I've heard for American healthcare, which is that American healthcare costs more, but that money goes to R&D. I find that hard to accept in any way, but I've heard that argument.
Yeah.
Michael, that's a great question.
if we look at the stats, U.S. pays amongst the highest, bill for their cable with amongst the worst access.
Yes.
So that,
I guess another reason you haven't gotten a lot of pushback is people hate cable companies. They're just
That's true.
When they told people about favorite brands, AT&T and Comcast are usually at the very bottom. No, we have a couple of comments from the chat along this. Jonathan Poritz asks if the UN deemed internet access a basic human right. I think that's right. And then I shared a very sad story from Maine, where Maine's governor met with a high school student who was concerned about net neutrality, and he told her, just read a book. So,
is that Paul LePage? Is he? Is that Maine's? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, it's quite. We have another question coming in from David Raths. Let's see. Can we flash down the screen, or will he join us? David asks, have you studied student privacy as it relates to learning analytics on campus? European universities seem to be more advanced than U.S. higher education in thinking through these issues. So the question is student privacy and learning analytics.
Yeah, I'm actually a gigantic skeptic when it comes to student analytics. But let me first say that I think the most important thing we can think about when we talk about these issues is consent. And so much of the student analytics never ask the student what they want. And the example, and so the way I think about this, right, is like personally, and I'm not the only one to make this argument, but I think that the web as we know it is a very as it exists now is a really faulty model, which is I'm gonna, like by nature of you being on this website or using this service, like I take the right, okay, like we don't give it to people, Like we actually, and I can expand on that if you want. I take the right to follow you everywhere and extract anything I want from you. So there's a lot of things wrong with that. Okay. And so, and again, by extract, and I'm using shorthand. I could expand on any of these things, but by extract, what I mean is, like, if there's anyone here who doesn't use Facebook, like Facebook still has a file on you. If there's anyone here who doesn't use Gmail, Gmail still has a file on you. We don't have any choice in being part of that system. That's not a good model for how we should operate. And so I'm really suspicious and very critical of importing that model and using it on students. It's a faulty and invasive model. And so, I'm also very suspect of some of the claims about learning analytics. I think we can see some of the discrimination and bias built into algorithms when we look at predictive policing or Uber schedules or Amazon Prime delivery or sentencing. I mean, the list is pretty endless. And so just to import those models on and into education, I'm not okay with it. And again, this is to go back to Michael Berman's question. This is an area where I receive a lot of pushback. I mean, and some people would even argue, and do even argue, that given the utopian claims that learning analytics people make, it's irresponsible not to use learning analytics. I take issue with that. But again, I mean, coming from a place of consent, right? Like, at least do that, right? At least say to people, here's what we want to do, and here's how we think it can help you. Okay, so if we just did that, which we don't in most cases. If we just did that, then we could have some different discussions.
That would be fascinating. That should be easy to do too.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, in one chat box, Lenny, please, if I mispronounced this, please forgive me. Lenny Whitley gives us a link to the Wikipedia page on right to internet access, which is extensive and quite vast. We have a question from Scott Robinson, who wants to follow up on the Facebook issue. Let's see what Scott has to say. Scott asked about monetization of privacy. Most users, quote, pay for Facebook by giving up their privacy in terms of data. Do you foresee other areas of life where only the privileged will be able to afford their privacy? Great dystopian question, Scott.
Yeah. Hey, Scott. I think that's, in my estimation, we're going there fast. And just some basic things like Apple phones generally offer you more privacy and security than the Android phones. Well, hey, I guess what? Apple phones cost a lot more. Again, to use a previous example, I mean, there's this huge push for autonomous vehicles. Well, like, who's going to pay for that, right? Well, the thing is, you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay for it by watching ads, by them tracking where you're going, right? So the Trojan horse, right, or the claim anyway, is that they're going to be safer, but the real, and I hesitate to say this because it sounds tinfoil hat, but I'll be happy to provide things I would consider documentation. Right? The real the end game of most of these platforms is to surveil you constantly, and to take every second that you exist, as part of either to monetize your attention or to to accumulate data on you and to use it to put it to some purpose in the future. The people who will be less now there's two parts of that question. First of all, the more affluent have less to worry about in terms of that being a concern, right? So, like, if so to use an example, like, if there's an algorithm that can tell people, all right, well, I'm going to say something that may seem controversial, but drug use in suburban communities is roughly the same as in minority, as in like inner city communities. Most of us know that. Okay. Drug arrests are not the same. Those numbers are not the same. Right? Drug prosecutions and who's in jail for drug use, those are not the same. So like as algorithms start to detect your behavior, and figure out who's doing what and where and at what times, right? Well, there are certain people who it doesn't really matter that they're doing drugs in their home or their kids are doing drugs or whatever. Like they're not going to jail for it. And there are for other communities for whom that's a real problem, and they'll go to jail for minute amounts of that, right? So there are lots of behaviors that are innocuous when done by the powerful, and punished very heavily when done by the relatively powerless. And so I do think people will be able to afford to not be surveilled, but I also think that they'll have less problems with being surveilled.
And it's like, which is how noble the law is, that in its majestic equality, that both the rich and the poor are equally prohibited from sleeping under bridges and stealing bread.
Yes.
In our book club last year, we were reading Kathy O'Neill's fantastic Weapons of Math Destruction, and she mentions the idea of the E-score, and this is a kind of digital profile that companies will build up on somebody based on whatever pieces of data they have. And so I guess we have this problem now that students will be able to develop something like an E-score for students, and only the wealthy will be able to avoid that. But I don't want to take over the podium here. We have Roxanne Riskin who wants to join us on stage. Let's see if Roxanne can beam up, and hopefully with her puppy, because I am in love with her puppy. We for this. Let's see if we got Roxanne. Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Very well. Yes.
I love your
Hello, Roxanne.
I love your research, Chris. Thanks, Brian.
Oh, thank you.
It's fantastic. I am just so happy there's a blizzard here in Connecticut so I could read it more of it this afternoon. Let's see. This is can you see that?
Okay, I gotta close a little box. Yes.
Okay. Search engine optimization, data analytics. This is what they're after. That's what we give them.
Yeah.
Every time we log in, we have an option to give away our privacy and our information, and we rapidly do that. So Michael Berman mentioned the radio. We were having this awesome conversation in a chat, and radio in the day was a one-way communication, but the minute you log on, and ARPANET, DARPANET, all of our communications with academia and social communications of now, when we use our search engines, we're readily giving them as much as they want, and they're collecting the money, and they're using it in any way they want to.
Right, absolutely. I completely agree.
Now the question I have for you, Chris, is what can we do to help our students know that this is the dilemma of their generation?
Well, first off, not a lot of people know this, and I think people know it sort of in theory, but they've never seen it work, right? So they don't know what, like you might illustrate what happens if you search for something on the school network versus on a phone, that's not connected to the network. You might have them compare their journal access with someone who goes to a more prestigious institution or a less prestigious institution. You might ask them about their own access and what issues they've had, and to talk about how that matters. There's some little things we can do. You can use different search engines. You can, clear out your cache. You can use Privacy Badger and Ghostery and there's, I think truly what we need to do is build awareness, so that we can have some larger scale changes, right? Institutional changes. As someone mentioned, like the EU has much stronger privacy laws than the US does, right? I mean, we have people get to shout innovation and do kind of whatever they want. And that is not an exaggeration. I mean, that's a lot of how we got to where we are now. And so I think awareness in our teaching practices, and also, again, like teach in a way that respects these things. And so, so I talk to my students all the time about different practices, like tech practices that are done in other in their other classes. And this is an egregious example, but I had a student who they had an assignment where they had to connect their Facebook profile to their LinkedIn profile. Like that was the assignment, and they were punished for not doing that. Whoa. And I thought, like, this is abuse, right? This is like pedagogical malpractice. You can't do that. Like, you should not do that, right? And so we have to teach in ways that show students that like what is the right way to do things, right? Just because Zuckerberg and Sergey Brin and Eric Schmidt, and Peter Thiel and whoever thinks that like this is the way things should operate, like we should not operate that way.
Well, great question, Roxanne.
Can I have a follow-up?
Rich answer.
Can I have a follow-up?
Please.
Okay. Those are great for our students. What educates our professors?
Oh gosh. That is a much harder question. Wow. I mean, I guess it depends on your position at an institution. Sometimes we're in a position to nudge, and I mean, sometimes we have a hammer, what I mean? Like, so for instance, like I'm a very strong, I hate Turnitin. I'll just be explicit. I hate Turnitin. And the at the writing lab, they asked me to give a talk, and I was like, nobody should use Turnitin. It's evil. Like, don't ever use it. Well, the people at the writing center can't really say that. Like, but there's some other things they can do, like talk about some of the privacy concerns, talk about some of the questions about ownership of one's own material, talk about assignment design, because I think at the root, like nobody wants like if you're at an institution, you don't want students to plagiarize. Like we all agree on that, right? So at institutions, often we all have very similar goals. And so at least we have that. And so we can talk about better ways to achieve those goals that don't violate people's privacy, or that don't force them into a system, into a relationship with a system where they have no choices. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be at an institution where I can kind of say, I'm doing this and I'm not doing that, but we're all not so fortunate. But there are ways big and small. But even having conversations, I think, my kind, and by my kind, I mean professors, are sort of notoriously believe often that they're experts in things that they are not experts in.
Yes.
So even having little hallway conversations, like, hey, what do you think about this? Or like, I just read Weapons of Math Destruction or Black Box Society. Like, maybe you should check it out. Yeah.
Well,
do you see that students, their education is coming out of high school a little bit in need of more awareness?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at least with my students, anecdotally, they're not getting this information. Not at all.
Do you have any thoughts on how we can improve on that? And then I'll sign off. Boot me off.
Well, this ties into your previous question, because in my experience, again, like many people don't know. I mean, like they know if I go to Google and type something in, it's kind of sort of based on what I've done before. Like most people know that, but they don't really know the depths to which that happens. But they also don't know. One of the difficulties in a lot of these discussions is talking about harm. Okay, like how is what is happening bad for me, or how is it bad for my students, or how is it bad for education? So this is it's a very esoteric concept. Because I'm sure you've heard like, oh, I have nothing to hide, or, like some variation of that. But just pedagogically, it's very problematic to have people going to a place that they think is there to give them answers when it's really there to spy on them, right? It's not there, like Google is not there to give you the right answer. Like they'd like to, but it's not their primary concern. And I'm sorry to anyone for whom that is like a surprise or a shock, or who disagrees with me. That is not the main reason Google exists. And so the sooner people accept that, at whatever level, the sooner we can start to have some more productive conversations. But again, they're not being had, and I mean, there's restrictions. Like, I mean, there's no to a lot, the large extent, there's no like curricular avenue for these discussions to be had in a lot of high schools. Not that I'm aware of.
It's pretty rare, and I wonder too how often it's marked by class. The wealthier schools have the ability to have this. We have a stack of questions, and we have a dwindling stack of minutes to discuss them. And nice so I'd like to give prior. Roxanne is awesome. I would love to see somebody else who wants to join us on stage with video as well. Hopefully we can have this is a serious New England attack now, because we've got Robin from New Hampshire, me from Vermont. So let's see if the infrastructure holds up. Robin, can you hear us? Oh, I hope so.
Oh no!
Oh,
hey,
all pixelated.
Oh, there we go.
We can hear you, but you're pixelated. I think the broadband was too much for the network, or possibly the storm. Let's try this again. For one more time.
Hello.
Robin.
Hey.
Hello.
Oh, it's so good to see you. Is that Phil with you? We might be having too much of a lag.
It's good to see you. How am I pixelated?
Yeah, Pixelation is setting it again. I'm sorry, Robin. Looks like the storm or just New England broadband wasn't going to have you come through. Let's take a couple of these more questions from the text chat and from the questions that have been submitted. Let's see. Who do we have next, Tara? Well, while she's bringing that up, we have this is from Regina Gong, who asks, so given all these surveillance, monetization of data, redlining, how do we in higher ed envision a new way to exist online? Fantastic question, Regina.
Yeah, so that is that's a tough one, right? And I mean, part of the problem is that again, like almost all the services we see are based on that model, right? So we almost don't have. I mean, there are some examples, but you have to dig deep, and it requires people who know sort of the history of the internet, but are also able to think about new possibilities. And as someone pointed out in the comment thread, I mean, so much of this is tied to funding, right?
Right.
I mean, like one of the early, as some of these issues started to manifest, one of the early suggestions that came out of Berkman Center at Harvard was like, oh, everyone should just hire a chief privacy officer. It's like, yeah, that's really interesting, right? Like, like every school, every district, every college, this is going to
that's a Harvard answer.
Yeah, right. Like, oh yeah, it's a good idea. And I think again, like I start from the position of making sure people understand that the way it is not the way it has to be. There's a really good, and I push this really hard all the time. There's a guy I follow on Twitter. I don't know what he does, but he writes fantastic essays. And his name's Elam Sakasis, and he wrote a thing that's called that he has coined the Borg complex, right? Which is this idea that tech is inevitable, right? Resistance is futile.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we know what something is, and again, this goes back to redlining, right? And back to a question I think some people had, right? What is the difference between the divide and redlining? Like when I talk about redlining, I talk about specific policies and decisions that brought us to where we are. So these things aren't accidents; they're not natural. They're the result of specific choices and decisions and priorities that could be done differently. Um, and if we understand that, then we could start to think about ways to do them differently. But to treat it as inevitable or natural is, I think, really dangerous and not and wrongheaded, to be honest. Um, so so the reason why does the LMS exist, right? Why does Facebook exist? Like, why is facial recognition in the EU? Well, you have to get permission, and in the US, like, you don't own your own face. Like, why are those things the way they are? And those are specific decisions. Though those are specific interests. And so, I mean, I talk about these things in my class. I mean, I teach comp, right? So there's opportunities to talk about them. And so with that, I think we can start to think about what's different. But again, I go back to, like, what do we do in our practices, right? So, I mean, Google Documents is really convenient.
Mm-hmm.
It's super convenient, but it's also Google, So, are there other ways we could do that thing without making our students a subject of surveillance capitalism? Like, it might be a little more difficult, right? It might require a little bit more ingenuity. Or do we offer students options or assignments that, so if let's say I have an assignment where I'd like you to do something on Twitter. Well, how about an assignment for people who don't want to do that? And talking about, what some of the implications are.
Oh, that's a fascinating idea.
I think I think we have to practice those things. And I mean, I use that word practice intentionally, rather than assume that the way that things are is the way that they have to be and that they're going to continue to be.
That was an incredibly bold question, and it's one I think we're going to be thinking about very hard for the rest of the year. And I think, Chris, that was a great answer. We have more questions that are just coming in thick and fast, like snow. We have one from Andy Anderson, who is also probably being snowed in. Andy asks, regarding filtering, is there a difference between community colleges and public universities? Between public universities and private non-denominational universities, between private non-denominational universities and private religious universities?
That's a fantastic question. So I should point out that filtering the internet on college campuses is relatively rare. Where you can find some of the distinctions is in the acceptable use policies of different colleges. My colleague Hugh and I looked at probably about 150 different colleges, and it's sort of the policies of those colleges. It sort of plays out that the more restrictive, like that, the less prestigious, or I should just say, the less money an institution has, the more restrictive their policies tend to be. And that isn't, interestingly, we did not detect any real connection to whether that was private or public, right? I mean, I had assumed that private institutions or religious institutions might be more restrictive. What I've found so far hasn't worked out that way. What I'd really like to do is get a grant to do a large study of that, but I don't know if that's coming anytime soon. That's a really interesting question.
I've worked with maybe 300 colleges and universities over the past 10 years, and I can think of two where I ran into active filtering. I wasn't looking for it, but where I actually bumped into them myself. And both of them were private. Both of them were different degrees religious, and both were very, very, very low resourced. So anecdotally, that's some confirmation.
And one other thing, there's a really good study a guy named Chris Peterson did, and a couple of his colleagues, who unfortunately I don't know their names, but he looked at filtering in K through 12. And Melinda Anderson now still has a really great article on this in The Atlantic. He looked at filtering in K through 12. And so what a lot of people don't know is that filtering is mandated, government is federally mandated in K through 12.
Yep.
But what kind of filter you use is actually not. And so there are all these sort of homebrew filters that some K through 12 places use. It's a really interesting and amusing study. I mean, but also has some like odd and unfortunate pedagogical implications, right? Because a college in Mississippi is using a different filter than one in Arkansas with different settings, than one in Detroit, than one in Boston, right? It's really worth looking at.
And some of them cloak what they're actually filtering or their mechanisms by intellectual property, so you can't tell. We have time for one last question, and this is from Lenny. And Lenny, if I massacre your name, please let me know how to say it correctly. Lenny asks, so should we let our students know that we're using analytics in our course? Do you think we need to have bigger conversations about how we use analytics? I think so.
I absolutely do. I mean, I don't think, and again, I've caught some heat for this position, but I'll continue to espouse it. I think that the way that the web works is abusive and invasive. And I don't think we should replicate that model if we ever have any choice in doing that. And so I don't even have, like, if my students are absent, I tell them, I don't want you to tell me why you were absent, right? Like, it's not my business.
Right.
And so, I think that the idea that because people are always exuding data, that we have the right to extract it is a very harmful idea that's been used in ways. And part of this, let me explain a little bit why I think that really quickly. Part of the problem with there's no consent, right? And there's information asymmetry, and there's lots of problems with it. But part of it is I can't tell a student I can't say this is only going to be used in this way at this time and never misused. Or it's only going to be used in this way at this time and then we're going to delete it. Because that's not what happens, right? It's like we're going to collect it and we're going to use it for this now, and we might use it for something different later. If the company gets sold, all bets are off. So we don't control how it's used. And so it's inherently unethical to say, I'm going to take information about you. I'm going to take it from you. I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to tell you how I'm going to use it, when I'm going to use it, how it's going to be used in the future, and how it might be used against you. Like, we shouldn't do that. Like, that's not right. So because we can't say, and that's not even talking about like hacks and breaches and leaks and things like that. That's just talking about what's legal, right? When a company gets sold, like any agreement they made with their users is gone. So I can't say, well, I just did this then, and that's the only way it's going to be used, and we'll delete it. Because, again, like this, most of the analytics isn't housed locally. It's not sourced locally. It's not, it's not controlled locally. And so, yeah, I think we need to be having much more and different discussions about that.
Higher education technology made a major outsourcing strategy decision over the past 20 years. Speaking of time, we're out of time. Chris, this has been stupendous. You've been so generous with your thoughts, and you've answered a crazy variety of questions. I want to thank you so much for your time. I have one question to ask. Can we bring you back later on?
Oh yeah, anytime. Yeah, I mean, I'm a total nerd for this stuff, so I mean, anytime.
Love that. Thank you. Now, what's the best way for people to keep up with you? Your hypervisible Twitter feed?
I'm a unfortunate Twitter constant user, so I'm on Twitter all the time. But if anybody wants to contact me with like a, an individual question or something, I'll be happy to talk to them about it. You can reach me through that, or message me, and I'll send you my email.
I think you'll see a whole bunch of tweets from the past hour. I've been trying to keep up with, and I couldn't. I'm going to follow up right after this. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody for showing up.
And I want to second that. Thank you, everybody, for the fantastic questions. This is a powerful topic, and one that we're going to resume, I think, throughout the year. So thank you all again for your questions. Now, speaking of questions, we have a whole bunch of things in the pipeline. So next week, we have Dr. Katie Lindner. She's from Oregon State University's eCampus. She's a research director there, and she has a really interesting project, a database about how people learn online. This is a unique project, and I think one that we will all find really useful. So now, note, this is next Monday, not next Thursday. That's because I have a crazy schedule next week. So please remember next Monday, and I'll send out an email to everyone. And also along the way, you have the opportunity to pick our next reading. So our book club just finished Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction. We're now trying to pick our next nonfiction reading. So go to the blog, click on the survey. There's a really wide variety of books to choose from, covering a variety of topics from social media to mobile devices to security to pedagogy to education as a whole. The voting is fast and furious. Please join us and pick what you'd like to read next. And beyond that, I just want to say, if you want to learn more about the forum, go to ftte.us. If you want to learn more about this technology we've been using, go to shingdag.com. And we thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.